Hello everyone, and welcome. Today, we're excited to explore the macroscopic characters of wood. This is the first slide of our presentation, titled Macroscopic Characters of Wood. We'll be looking at the key features that can be observed with the naked eye and how they help us understand wood better. Over the next few slides, I'll guide you through the main characteristics and their significance. So let's get started and enjoy the journey into the fascinating world of wood. Let's take a look at some macroscopic characters of wood. These are features that we can actually see with our naked eye, so no need for a microscope here. One of the most important features is the annual rings. These rings are really useful because they give us a lot of information about the tree's growth. You can often see them as concentric circles on a cross-section of the wood. Recognizing these rings helps us determine the age of the tree and understand its growth conditions. So, when we're examining wood casually, these macroscopic features like the annual rings are key indicators that tell us a lot without needing any special tools. Today, I want to introduce you to the three main planes of wood, which are fundamental to understanding its structure and properties. First, we have the transverse plane, which cuts across the growth rings, giving us a cross-sectional view of the wood. This perspective is useful for examining the arrangement of vessels and the overall grain pattern. Next is the tangential plane, which runs along the tangent to the growth rings. When we look at this surface, we can see the annual rings in a profile, helping us understand growth patterns and how wood might behave under certain stresses. Lastly, there's the radial plane, which extends from the center of the tree outward along the radius. This view reveals the rays and the growth rings in a way that highlights the radial structure. Understanding these three planes is crucial because each offers unique insights into the wood's characteristics, which directly impact how we work with and utilize wood in different applications. Connecting this to our overall theme, recognizing these planes helps us choose the right cuts and treatments for durability, appearance, and strength. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide. Let's talk about growth rings. A growth ring is essentially a layer of wood that forms in a plant during a single period of growth. When you cut a tree crosswise, these rings become visible as concentric circles. They vary in width, which can tell us a lot about the tree's growth conditions each year. These rings are produced by the vascular cambium, a layer of cells that generates new tissue. Most of these rings represent a full year's worth of growth, so we often call them annual rings. Understanding these rings helps us learn about the tree's age and the environmental factors that influenced its growth over time. This concept ties into our overall theme of examining how plants grow and adapt over time. Let's take a closer look at annual rings. These are the concentric rings you can see on the wood of a cut tree trunk or other woody stems. Each of these rings actually represents a specific period of growth. During this time, the tree lays down new xylem tissue to replace the older tissue that's being converted into wood, a process known as secondary xylem formation. The most important point here is that these rings can tell us a lot about the tree's age and growth conditions over time. By examining the size and density of each ring, we can infer environmental factors like rainfall or droughts that affected the tree during different years. This concept ties into the overall theme of understanding plant growth and how trees record their history through these visible patterns. Let's take a look at annual rings and false rings. When we examine tree trunks, we often see these concentric circles called annual rings. These rings are formed each year as the tree grows, and they can tell us a lot about the tree's age and the environmental conditions during each year. However, sometimes we encounter false rings, which can be a bit confusing. False rings are bands that look like regular annual rings, but aren't actually formed by a new year's growth. They can occur due to environmental stress, like drought or irregular weather patterns, causing the tree to produce a partial growth layer within a single year. Understanding the difference between true annual rings and false rings is crucial because it helps us interpret the tree's growth history accurately. Recognizing false rings allows us to better assess how environmental factors influence tree growth over time, tying directly into our overall theme of understanding ecological responses through dendrochronology. Growth rings sometimes fail to form around the complete cross-section of a tree. This happens because the cambium, which is responsible for producing new growth, remains dormant in one or more areas around the stem. Essentially, the cambium stops active growth in certain spots, leading to incomplete rings. This dormancy can be caused by factors like the availability of auxins, which are growth hormones, and a deficiency of nutrients or food supply. When the tree doesn't have enough resources, it can't sustain uniform cambial activity all the way around. You'll often notice these incomplete or interrupted rings in trees that have one-sided crowns, meaning their branches are mostly on one side, or in trees that are heavily defoliated, suppressed, or overmature. These are signs that the tree's growth has been uneven or stressed, affecting how the rings develop. When we talk about discontinuous rings, we're referring to these incomplete growth patterns, where the rings don't form in a continuous circle. Recognizing these features is important because it helps us understand the history of the tree's growth conditions and overall health. This ties into the broader theme of how environmental and physiological factors influence tree growth patterns. Normal seasonal growth is usually a steady and predictable process, but it can be interrupted by various environmental events. Things like drought, late frost, defoliation caused by insects, or hail can all disrupt this growth. When we look at an annual ring formed under such stressful conditions, we often notice something interesting. There are actually two rings visible. These are what we call false rings. False rings are basically rings that appear similar to regular annual rings, but are formed due to these abnormal growth conditions. Recognizing these false rings is important because they can tell us a lot about the environmental stresses the tree experienced during that particular year. They help us understand how trees respond to adverse conditions, which ties into our overall theme of understanding tree growth and environmental impacts. Let's talk about false rings. These are rings that appear in some trees not because of true annual growth, but due to other factors. They can be caused by environmental stresses like drought, disease, or even physical damage. Essentially, what happens is that the tree produces a layer of latewood that looks similar to an annual ring, but it doesn't correspond to a year's worth of growth. This can be misleading if you're trying to date a tree or interpret its growth history. Recognizing false rings is important because if we mistake them for true rings, we might get inaccurate data about the tree's age or the environmental conditions during its growth. So, understanding the difference between true rings and false rings helps us make more precise interpretations in dendrochronology. It ties into our overall theme of careful analysis and avoiding common pitfalls when studying tree records. Let's talk about the concept of a false ring. A false ring is essentially a deceptive signal, something that looks like a real indicator but isn't actually meaningful. In many contexts, it can be a visual cue or a behavior that mimics genuine signals but is misleading. The key point here is understanding that not everything that appears significant truly is, sometimes, what we see can be a false indicator. Recognizing these false rings is crucial because they can lead us astray if we rely on them without further investigation. This ties into the overall theme of the presentation, which emphasizes the importance of critical analysis and not taking things at face value. Being able to identify false rings helps us make better, more informed decisions and avoid pitfalls caused by superficial or misleading cues. Wood grain refers to the way the fibers in the wood are aligned, and it also includes the texture and overall appearance of those fibers. This alignment is really important because it can influence how we work with the wood, whether we're cutting, shaping, or finishing it. Understanding the grain helps us choose the right techniques for a better result. When we talk about the alignment of the wood in the tree, we often make a distinction called grain orientation. This is basically about how the fibers run, whether they go along the length of the piece or cross in different directions. Recognizing these differences is key because it affects the strength, appearance, and workability of the wood. So, in our overall discussion of woodworking, paying attention to wood grain and its orientation helps us make smarter choices and achieve a higher quality finish. let's take a closer look at the different types of grain in wood, starting with diagonal grain. This occurs when the grain runs at an angle to the board's length, which can affect how the wood responds to cutting or finishing. Next, we have spiral grain, where the grain twists around the trunk, often creating a decorative effect but sometimes challenging for woodworking. Straight grain is when the fibers run parallel along the length of the wood, providing strength and stability, making it ideal for many projects. Wavy grain features a gentle, undulating pattern, adding visual interest but potentially complicating machining. Irregular grain is quite unpredictable, with inconsistent patterns that can make working with the wood more challenging, but can also produce unique aesthetics. Interlocked grain happens when fibers grow in opposite directions, creating a natural interlocking pattern that can add strength, but may cause splitting or tearing during processing. Lastly, grain orientation refers to the overall direction of the fibers within the wood, which is crucial because it impacts both the strength and appearance of the finished piece. Recognizing these different grain types helps us choose the right wood and techniques for our projects, ensuring quality and durability. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide. When we talk about diagonal grain, we're referring to what happens when a straight-grained log isn't sawn along its vertical axis. Instead, the fibers end up running at an angle, which can affect the strength and appearance of the wood. Now, straight grain is pretty straightforward, literally. It means the fibers in the board run roughly parallel to the vertical axis of the log they come from. This type of grain is usually desirable because it tends to be stronger and more uniform. Wavy grain is quite interesting because it occurs when the direction of the wood fibers keeps changing as you move along the board. This creates a more decorative, rippled appearance, but it can also influence how the wood behaves under stress. Then we have interlocked grain, which results from trees whose fibers line up in opposite directions during different growth years. This causes the fibers to interlock, leading to boards that might be more resistant to splitting, but can also be a bit more challenging to work with. Understanding these different grain patterns helps us predict how the wood will perform and look in our projects, tying into the overall theme of selecting the right material for the right purpose. Now, let's take a closer look at the differences between late wood and early wood. Late wood, which forms towards the end of the growing season, is typically dense and dark. This density results from the deposition of smaller, thicker-walled cells during late summer and fall. It's like the tree is packing more material into each cell as the season winds down. On the other hand, early wood is characterized by large cells with thin walls, and it forms in the spring when growth is rapid. These larger, thinner-walled cells help the tree efficiently transport water and nutrients at the start of the growing season. When we look at the combination of late and early wood, it tells a story about the tree's growth cycle. The contrast between the dense, dark late wood and the lighter, larger early wood is quite striking. Understanding these differences helps us interpret the tree's annual growth patterns and how it responds to seasonal changes. This knowledge ties directly into our broader discussion of how trees adapt and grow over time. Now, let's talk about heartwood. Heartwood is the central part of a tree that has stopped growing and has essentially died. This process happens naturally and is driven by genetic programming within the tree. One key point is that heartwood becomes highly resistant to decay, which is crucial for the tree's overall health and longevity. If you look at a cross-section of a stem, the heartwood appears as a darker, discolored circle in the center. It follows the shape of the annual rings, giving us a visual clue about the tree's age and growth patterns. So, the dark-colored portion in the cross-section is the heartwood, and it plays an important role in providing structural support. Understanding heartwood helps us appreciate how trees develop their strength and durability over time, tying into the overall theme of how trees grow and adapt. Let's take a closer look at the structure of a tree, specifically focusing on the heartwood and sapwood. The heartwood is the central, often darker part of the tree. It provides structural support and is rich in resins and chemicals that help protect the tree from decay and pests. Meanwhile, the sapwood surrounds the heartwood and is responsible for transporting water and nutrients from the roots up to the leaves. It's usually lighter in color and more active in the tree's life processes. Understanding the difference between these two is crucial because it affects the wood's properties and how we use it. For example, the heartwood tends to be more durable and resistant to rot, making it ideal for certain applications. This distinction ties into the overall theme of how trees grow and how their internal structures influence the quality and usability of the wood we harvest. Recognizing these parts helps us appreciate not just the beauty of the wood, but also its biological functions and practical value. This is darker than sapwood, which is an important distinction when we're considering its appearance and potential use. The heartwood may also be highly resistant to decay and insects, making it a durable choice for many applications. However, keep in mind that it can be difficult to penetrate with liquids, so treatments like preservatives or finishes might not be as effective or easy to apply. Drying this type of wood can also be challenging, as it tends to resist moisture loss, which can lead to issues like warping or cracking if not properly managed. You might notice it has a distinct odor, which is characteristic and can sometimes help in identifying it. In terms of weight, heartwood usually has a slightly higher weight per unit volume compared to sapwood, which contributes to its overall strength and density. Interestingly, it also has low hygroscopicity, meaning it doesn't absorb moisture from the environment easily, helping it resist swelling or shrinking due to humidity changes. Lastly, the fiber saturation point is reduced in heartwood, which affects how it interacts with moisture at a cellular level. Overall, these properties of heartwood make it a valuable material for durability and longevity, especially in outdoor or demanding environments. Sapwood is the living part of the wood in a growing tree. All the wood you see in a tree starts out as sapwood. Its main roles are to carry water from the roots all the way up to the leaves, which is essential for the tree's survival and growth. Additionally, sapwood stores food that the tree makes in its leaves and then releases it when needed, depending on the season. It's interesting to note that there's no fixed link between the annual rings of growth and the amount of sapwood present. This means that even if the rings are narrow or wide, the amount of sapwood doesn't necessarily change in a predictable way. So, in the context of wood and its functions, sapwood plays a vital role in the tree's health and sustenance. It's a living, active part that helps the tree grow and adapt throughout the seasons. A knot is a specific type of imperfection that we often encounter in timber. While it can weaken the wood, it also offers an interesting visual element that can be used artistically. It's fascinating to see how these natural features can add character to wood products. As the tree grows, it adds new layers of wood seasonally. This means that each layer builds upon the previous one, creating a layered structure over time. When we look at a long, longitudinally sawn plank, these knots typically show up as roughly circular, solid-looking areas. But what's really happening inside? A knot is actually a part of a side branch, or sometimes a dormant bud that became included in the main stem or a larger branch during growth. So, in essence, it's a little piece of the tree's branch system embedded within the trunk. Understanding knots helps us appreciate the natural complexity of timber. They are imperfections, yes, but also a testament to the tree's growth process and natural history. Let's talk about knots. Knots are a fundamental concept in both physical and conceptual terms. They can represent complex problems or challenges that are intertwined, making them difficult to untangle. In many situations, understanding how knots form and how to approach untying them is crucial. What's important to remember is that knots aren't just about physical ropes. They symbolize complications or obstacles in our processes, our projects, or our thinking. Recognizing the nature of a knot helps us decide the best strategy to resolve it. Throughout this presentation, we've emphasized the importance of identifying issues early and understanding their structure. Knots remind us that sometimes we need patience, careful analysis, and the right techniques to untangle complex situations. By mastering the concept of knots, whether literal or metaphorical, we better equip ourselves to navigate and resolve the challenges we face, keeping our work flowing smoothly and efficiently. Now, let's look at the difference between a pruned and an unpruned tree. When we build decision trees, the goal is to create a model that generalizes well to new data. An unpruned tree is basically grown to its full depth, splitting until it can no longer improve, which often leads to overfitting. Overfitting means the tree performs perfectly on training data, but struggles with new, unseen data. Pruning, on the other hand, is like trimming a tree, removing branches that don't add much value. It simplifies the model, reducing complexity and helping it generalize better. The key idea here is balancing the tree's fit, making sure it captures the true patterns without capturing the noise. So, in essence, pruning creates a more robust, simplified model, which is especially important when we're aiming for good performance on real-world data. It ties into our overall theme of building effective, generalizable machine learning models by managing complexity wisely.